Okay.
It'd be weak, I wish I was with you in person, but that's the way it is. Well, let's get started. I would like to say I'm happy to stop and take questions at any point in time. This is really a pretty complex subject, generally speaking. There are a lot of names, a lot of acronyms. So I'm happy to stop as we go along. Just let me know if questions come up as we proceed. And this is really a very interesting subject to me because for two particular reasons. First of all, the things that I'm going to be saying were virtually unknown to us. Certainly, they weren't part of the general conversation when I began inquiry into this subject almost 30 years ago now, it seems. So it reflects a lot of the research that's been done, kind of amazing research, and although we complain about not having all the documents we want, it's sort of amazing how much we've really learned from the documents that have been discovered through FOIA and through research in the archives. This subject, Staff D and the magic button, is also, I think, particularly interesting for two reasons. First of all, it introduces some of the names that we're all familiar with and generally names that come up in discussion of the JFK assassination frequently, whether it's William Harvey, James Angleton, more recently David Morales, more recently compared to the other two. And it also introduces us to the subject of the CIA and assassinations, which is again one of those things that has been relatively mysterious, but which we've learned a lot about in terms of their practices and their protocols and when they were authorized, because certainly they were authorized at different times. So with that as a background, I'll be talking about Staff D within the Directorate of Operations, and in particular the magic button, which is a phrase that came into use with William Harvey and Richard Helms in the 1962-1963 time frame. So let's go on to the next slide. And it's one of the things that's really important for context is that Staff D itself and a lot of what was going on with Staff D and William Harvey really were very much apart from the CIA operations that we've all come to know and be fascinated with in terms of overseas operations, JM Wave, the Cuba project, those sorts of things. Staff D was really established within the Operations Directorate with the project of obtaining information that would be used by the NSA. And I think, again, we think of the CIA operationally, but overall the CIA's role is the collection and analysis of information. And in this case, Staff D was simply a group of people that were tasked with obtaining code books and basically the sort of information that you would, not code books, encryption machines, devices, readers, the sort of things that would allow you to actually gain information from signals that you had intercepted either by tapping cables, by phone taps, by electronic intercepts, and to a large extent, Staff D within the CIA was providing tools that the NSA would use to interpret the information that it was collecting. And primarily, again, the NSA's function here was communications monitoring, intercepting military, diplomatic, and commercial transmissions. I think at this point in time, we have no illusions about the fact that the NSA, as well as British intelligence and other major intelligence agencies, collect all sorts of electronic information, certainly not just in military activities, but in basically general information about what any nation they consider an adversary is doing, or about commercial affairs. Economic intelligence is an important factor there. And as far as that goes, NSA it not only used the CIA to provide them with encryption material, decryption codes. They used the NSA, the NSA used the Air Force for the electronic intercepts and signals intelligence themselves. And we know that in, for example, for Europe, the Air Force operated security service stations had a couple of major British RAF air bases, Kirknewton in Scotland and Chicksands in England, performing electronics collection. We also know that the NSA used the Navy to tap commercial and Soviet cables for intelligence collection, and the NSA used the CIA itself in foreign stations, embassies, where the CIA was doing collections activities. Bill Snippage has written extensively about the CIA's electronic collections efforts in Mexico City. Again, this involved tapping telephone lines, placing bugs, in one of the most large-scale operations, especially for political and commercial intelligence that we've seen. Of course, the only thing comparable might be the tapping of Soviet cables in Berlin, but CIA foreign stations were very active in getting that sort of intelligence and providing it to the NSA. So that's what Staff D's fundamental role was. It had nothing to do with assassinations. It existed to enable intelligence collection through the NSA. Well, let's go to the next slide.
Okay, Larry.
And initially, Staff D's activities were almost entirely domestic within the United States, targeting intelligence collection around foreign embassies in the U.S., a lot of that going on around New York City, Washington, D.C., especially at the United Nations, and extreme efforts were taken to ensure deniability, of course. You really don't want people to know that, you're supporting diplomats at the UN so you can obtain codes and you're tapping their phones. And so to do that, the CIA needed real experts, professionals, the sort of people that could break into safes, place bugs in hotel rooms, and they turned to the professionals. Most of them came from not necessarily organized crime in the Godfather sense, but certainly out of the professional criminal pool of individuals. And in many cases, the CIA and Staff D were given some help in that through the Office of Security at the CIA and through their relationship with the FBI, who certainly was chartered with identifying and knowing where these types of organized criminals were and professionals were. And sort of interesting, some of the same people that the CIA was using for these types of activities were also at work in the underworld, and there was actually a relationship between the CIA and the FBI so that the FBI would be informed when the CIA was using them and not pick them up in an operation, blow the operation, or otherwise interfere. We have that's easy to say, but there certainly were times when the CIA used people that it didn't tell the FBI about, and we have probably one example of that most of us know about when in conjunction with Cuban operations, the CIA used Richard Mayhew's contacts to bring in a wiretap expert and collect some information on the Andrews sisters, and that thing really blew apart a CIA operation. So this kind of emphasizes why the FBI and CIA should have been on the same accord in terms of these sorts of intelligence collection activities and what can happen if they're not. So that was where Staff D began, and Staff D began, collections work began domestically. However, obviously, there's a desire to collect that same sort of information overseas, and that was a capability that the CIA did not have, even as of the end of the 1950s at the height of the Cold War. So let's go on to another slide, and we'll talk about foreign collections and how Staff D was brought into that. This might also be a good point for me to pause and see if there are any questions up to this slide.
Just one question, Larry. Moving on in time, another interesting part of history, I believe, was Berlin when Hess was still around. And one of the reasons that it's said that Spandau went on existing with Hess the only prisoner was because the Russians wanted access to the British sector so they could spy. Were the CIA operating, were they hacking into the Russian equivalent at that time in Berlin? What was happening at that time?
I would say the only known example of actually what you might call hacking tapping was with the Russian military cables that were coming into Berlin, and we're talking about physical cables, an underground telephone cable system, actually several cables, hundreds of wires in that, and this is the situation where William Harvey supervised actually digging into that cable system and tapping into it, and that's the only example I know of actually tapping in Berlin.
Right, thank you, Larry.
All right, CIA, and that brings up an interesting case because sometimes I think one thing that we have learned from the release of all the documents is that certainly sometimes we give the CIA more credit for capabilities than it actually demonstrated. Not that it wasn't trying to do a lot of things, but this stuff is really difficult, and you really don't want to get caught, and certainly the CIA itself was not nearly as invincible as its own senior people would have liked to have touted internally in the U.S. And this brings up another example of that that we're going into now. In 1959, the CIA received a request from its Far Eastern Division, and its Far Eastern Division was being very challenged about being able to interpret and decode Chinese communications, both diplomatic and military, but in particular diplomatic. There were a lot of things going on between China, nationalist China, communist China, and we really needed to know what was going on there, and literally NSA did not have, nor CIA, a lot of those code books and decryption capabilities. So, interestingly enough, this request didn't come from headquarters CIA, it didn't come from NSA, it came from the Far Eastern Division of the CIA, and their suggestion was that we actually send a team into Cuba, into Havana, and see if we could obtain code books or hardware, physical hardware, or tap communications going through the Chinese diplomatic facilities in Havana. So the CIA did send a team down to Havana. The team was led by literally the head of the CIA's technical staff working with electronics collections, a fellow named David Christ, who ended up with his entire team in a Cuban prison. And it's fascinating. If you're interested in this, there are actually extensive documents on this available through the CIA's own website, talking about how this group was compromised, the extreme threat that it posed, because the team leader literally needed us to know about the CIA's capability for electronic collections. And the Cubans had no idea who they'd taken into custody, and this was one of the greatest exposures that the CIA has faced. And there's a long saga in how they managed to finally get these people back without the Cubans understanding the real potential of the people that they held. And interestingly enough, part of this team came actually back at the same time John Martino was released, and he was kind of embedded in that release. Interesting overall story, but a real fiasco for the CIA. And what became really obvious at this point in time is, however good the agency might have been at doing these sorts of collections with Staff D inside the United States, they really did not have much of an overseas capability. The one exception was going to turn out to be Mexico City, even at this time. But other than that, they were extremely limited. So what we see in the next slide is the fact that in the late 1950s, circa 1959, 1960, a fellow was called back in to work with Staff D, who had worked as the head of Staff D and something that was informally referred to as Staff E back in the late 1940s, in the very earliest days of the CIA, and that was William Harvey. Staff E had been an electronics collection effort that had actually proceeded during the formation of the NSA. It was kind of a prototype where the CIA was there first and doing its own attempts at electronic collections, particularly through its foreign stations, before the NSA really got underway and took control. And as I mentioned before, one of the earliest successes of the CIA in this regard was the tap of a major Soviet cable system in Berlin, and Harvey himself had been in charge of that. So his credentials, his experience, his background in doing electronics collection, all sorts, in doing essentially counterintelligence work based in that was really great. I mean, he was the expert within the CIA at doing this sort of work, and that's why he was put in charge of Staff D circa 1959 after he came back from Berlin. And one of his first tasks was going to be expanding the foreign collection capabilities of Staff D. And we'll see that in the next slide.
Okay.
So, after the Cuban fiasco, after CIA headquarters really needed to get its act together, they really chartered Harvey with identifying and recruiting foreign criminal assets to do the same sort of Staff D work that had been done domestically. That was his task. And to get started in that, because they had some assets in Europe working for the individual country stations, but they really didn't have anything organized out of headquarters. So Harvey went to the CIA Office of Security and started asking for leads and contacts and potential candidates from their list of drug smugglers, burglars, basically professional criminals that they knew about overseas through the contacts that had been made by the individual country CIA stations. And initially, and we have the documents on this, Harvey came up with a list that included potential recruits, including safecrackers in Italy, forgers in France, and someone in Belgium who really knew a lot of people, especially in the drug smuggling venue, it appears, and might be very useful in going on to find the sorts of folks Harvey was really looking for. So let's go on to the next slide. And this individual was operated under the crypt QJWIN. We now know that his real name was Mankel, and he was a Belgian station asset who had been around for some time, since 1958. And I think we'll point out, it appears from what we know now, QJWIN was an interesting crypt, unlike others that we've seen, and basically it was a crypt used for different people at different times. So it may not have been assigned uniquely to Mankel, but certainly during the late 1950s and early 1960s, when you saw QJWIN in the document, this is who you were talking about. And Mankel had become a CIA asset in 1958. He worked directly under the supervision of the CIA station chief in Luxembourg at that point in time. And the first use of Mankel, before he was essentially passed on to Harvey to use in his recruiting, was that Mankel, fortunately for the CIA, held a Belgian passport, and he had been made available to Richard Helms for a poisoning attempt against Patrice Lumumba in the Belgian Congo. This again was a fiasco, and it showed how poorly organized the CIA was for doing this sort of thing overseas. Mankel and QJWIN was sent to Belgium. The whole thought was to get some poison that had been made in the CIA's technical support group to the station to the CIA station in there, and hand it off to this fellow who would somehow coordinate actually poisoning Lumumba. That sounds kind of strange. What's even stranger is they brought another fellow into the mix that had been working for them in Europe. His name was, and I can't really pronounce this, Ernest Meikrink, his crypt was W.I. Rogue, and he was operating in the Congo already under an alias. He had been recruited initially by the CIA as part of their Red Sox Red Cap military program, and that was in the early to mid-50s, circa 1956, when they were looking at inserting fairly significant numbers of paramilitary expatriates into Eastern European nations to really collect information and hopefully to stimulate insurgent, revolutionary activities against the Soviet regimes in the satellite countries. So these two showed up in Congo. Poison transfer didn't work. The whole thing fell apart, and QJWIN remained on board and on the payroll, and later on was handed over to Harvey for recruiting purposes. But certainly his first use in the Congo had not worked out well. We also, interestingly enough, know what his annual salary and expenses were, and QJWIN himself cost the CIA $7,200 a year, and all their other staff D expenses for Europe totaled only $14,700 a year. So that was more money back in the 1960s, but it still was obviously not a huge operation. Okay, let's go down.
Yep.
So how does all this tie into what we're interested in? How does all this somehow get involved in what we know as the magic button, ZR rifle, the Castro assassination program? How does that all come together? And the point is, it comes together slowly, and it came together quite a while before 1962, 1963. And it started with the fact that JM Wave Station operations manager named David Morales had been training special Cuban exile groups to work in intelligence and counterintelligence, and actually the plan was to make them the new Cuban intelligence service after Fidel Castro had been overthrown. So Morales had been training a lot of people in counterintelligence work, and insertions and intelligence collections, and that all fell apart because the Bay of Pigs fell apart, basically. It's interesting in looking at the documents, we find that really the only JM Wave staff person during the Bay of Pigs era that received any commendation and any remark that they'd done a good job was David Morales. But he had organized this special group of Cuban intelligence officers, and after the Bay of Pigs failed, they were brought back in to JM Wave and reformed as a special Cuban intelligence group to be used domestically. There was certainly the whole Bay of Pigs project, the Cuba project, had been heavily compromised by Cuban intelligence, and things were so bad that in the summer of 1961, when Harvey was assigned to a new anti-Castro project, and this whole thing was being reorganized for a new effort against Castro. The CIA's part of that was only part of it. Lansdale was leading the much larger project called Mongoose, but Harvey and Morales were going to be working on supporting this. Obviously, we needed a much better intelligence, counterintelligence going on, so they turned to these specialists in counterintelligence and assigned James Angleton to become involved, and he actually worked with this Morales' counterintelligence group and was tasked with implementing a lot better practices, helping consolidate the information that had been collected on Cuba, and basically the entire Cuba project was reworked in 1961 with three names that are very familiar to us involved, and that would be William Harvey, James Angleton, and David Morales. And as we'll see on the next page, let's go to the next page.
Yep.
By September and October 1961, one of the conclusions was that it was going to be very difficult to ever succeed in Cuba with Fidel Castro alive. And virtually everyone was saying that he had been the key to organizing the oppositions to the landings at the Bay of Pigs. He was just so critical that the only way to make this succeed was to have him assassinated. And at that point in time, that fall of 1961, Helms brought Harvey in and told him to activate a new executive action project. And we have had Harvey's notes from those meetings. We have some insight into what was going through his mind at the point in time. And although Helms was talking about executive action in a broad sense, it's very obvious that the first target of this project was going to be Fidel Castro. And interestingly enough, that meant that Harvey was going to have to take over a Castro assassination project that had been underway since 1960 involving John Roselli. John Roselli having been brought into that because of his contacts with casino people in Miami and his contacts with people who had run those casinos because they were hoping to use them to deliver poison. Again, poison being the choice in CIA assassinations. So, by the fall of 1961, we're going to have a new assassination project targeting Fidel Castro, led by William Harvey, who reactivates John Roselli, and Harvey's talking about how he's going to make this happen, and some of his first thoughts in his notes say, the person he needs to turn to for advice is James Angleton. For a couple of reasons. James Angleton is very much aware, because of his recent work on the Cuban project, of what's going on in Cuba. But Angleton has extensive experience in how to hide things within the CIA, and this project is going to have to be extremely extremely deniable. It's going to have to be hidden not only from everybody outside the CIA, but from people inside the CIA. Let's take another slide up and we'll look at some of Harvey's own notes, which caution himself never to mention the word assassination and object to it if anybody does, which actually in one staff meeting we know the special group, the Cuban special group, somebody mentions assassination and Harvey just goes ballistic and writes a memo saying people can't do that, that was insane. Never talk about assassination in any place where notes are going to be taken. This can't show up on paper. It's got to be person to person. And to use this, obviously to kill Castro, everybody's going to think we did it, so we've got to come up with some concept, some provision, some part of the operation that's going to make it look like the Soviets or some other foreign intelligence groups are in line with this and doing it for their own motivations. We've got to divert attention, which actually isn't as strange as it might seem, because in 61, 62, Castro is very upset with the Soviets. He's going to be very much more upset with them after the missile crisis. And there's a lot of jousting that goes on in Cuba for the next couple of years between Cuban communist parties, Soviet assets in Cuba, and Castro's paranoia about losing control of Cuba to other parties. In any event, we also know that Harvey decides that to make this even more deniable, he's going to hide the money and the people that are hard to do this. It looks like John Roselli is going to be the key under the crypt QJWIN, which he's already been using. And that will confuse things because QJWIN's already being paid, he's already in the files, and this will be a great way to hide this new program. Harvey's notes continue. Let's go to the next page. And talking about how much work he's going to have to do to set up files and expense reporting and get the right kind of people and bury this new executive action program. And that's what it comes down to. He's got to have the right person, he's got to have money, but deniability is as important as anything else. So, moving along pretty well. Any questions up to this point in time?
Any questions, folks?
Okay.
No.
All right, so let's go to the next slide where we actually finally show up with ZR rifle. Because while we're going to hide employment and expense money under QJWIN, QJWIN is a crypt, it's not a project. So we've got to have a project to do this, and we'll use a new project that is going to be created called ZR Rifle. And the way this comes out is during October 1961, as Harvey is kicking off this project. Actually, the interesting thing is he brought on board James Angleton, and Angleton helps him arrange a meeting with a British intelligence officer, talking about assassinations, getting advice, getting recommendations. Obviously, they think the British must know how to do this stuff. They're pretty skilled. Maybe they'll even do it for us. And they kind of float that idea, and that's not anything that the British part of the conversation likes, and so they kind of turn it back to them. But in the fall of 1961, then, during the winter of 1961, Harvey's trying to get a handle on how he's going to do this assassination project, and he's using Angleton. Harvey and Angleton essentially are working as a team in this, which is very interesting and has some interesting implications for 1963. But in any event, in February of 1962, Harvey actually gets it together and generates a crypt for this project, executive action project called ZR Rifle. Angleton's influence influence comes through clearly in this because, as we know now, Angleton was one of the very few people in the CIA, perhaps the only person, who routinely generated his own crypts outside the CIA system, because normally all those things are supposed to work in the system. You're going to have them on file. You're going to have files for them. And Angleton didn't play that game. We now know he had his own, even his own collection of thousands of files independent of the regular system. So clearly, Angleton's given Harvey some advice on how to do this and how to set up CR rifle where it's very deniable even within the CIA. So Harvey obfuscates the whole thing by hiding his new executive action program under an authorization that Richard Helms signs for employment of assets under Staff D. It's going to be Project CR Rifle, and the money is going to be allocated under QJWIN as an employment cover. All right. Next slide. So ZR Rifle, as of 1962 and going into 1963, ZR Rifle is going to be designated eyes only. It's extremely confidential. In April 1962, Harvey meets with Roselli and reactivates the Castro assassination project under ZR Rifle. And the first new attempt, again by poison, is organized out of JMWave with Morales and Shackley supporting it, and that follows within weeks, and it fails. And this continues month after month, and there's only going to be one real change in ZR Rifle during 1962 and 1963. The same players are going to be involved. The only target for ZR Rifle that we know of is Fidel Castro, and the only known primary asset is John Roselli. And this project is supported out of JMWave, and the only real player there is JMWave Operations Chief David Morales. So ZR Rifle, as it evolves during 1962, is hidden under Staff D. It's hidden under ZR Rifle. It's hidden under QJWIN, and the people involved are William Harvey, John Roselli, and David Morales. All right, let's go to the next slide. So 1963 is our year of interest. It's the year when the Kennedy assassination occurs. So what does ZR Rifle look like in 1963? Well, in summary, following the end of Mongoose and the end of Task Force W, which was the second Cuba project, that all comes to grief in late 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And basically, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, part of the resolution of the crisis is that JFK agrees to stop actively subverting the Cuban government, and pledges not to do that, and pledges to essentially agree to leave Castro in place. That may be the official pledge. We know that a third Cuba project is initiated under the Special Group Augmented and RFK in 1963, and they started sort of stumbling through, okay, could we reinvigorate this whole thing? Would it work if we assassinated Fidel? You know, all of that is in play. And equally in play during 1963 is a brand new outreach first from Castro to JFK, and then from JFK back to Castro, where JFK and Castro actually are about to initiate a dialogue to solve the problem through non-military means, with some kind of an accord where Cuba shifts more neutral, less Soviet, sanctions are removed. So all of that's in progress. Very chaotic situation in 1963. JFK's essentially on one track RFK's on another track, and, you know, it's bipolar. And while that is happening, Harvey and Roselli and Morales are definitely still trying to kill Fidel Castro. So you can't imagine something more entangled than what's going on in 1963. And we know that Richard Helms has funded ZR Rifle for 1963. So there's no doubt that ZR Rifle continued into 1963 and continued actively at least through the first half of the year. It does look like towards after the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 and through the first half of 1963, it appears that the focus of the assassination project shifted from the use of poison to actual attacks on Castro using sniper teams. There's talk of ambushes. So the tactics appear to have changed. There were efforts to put ZR rifle teams into Cuba for Harvey and Morales to infiltrate people into Cuba during the winter of 62, spring of 63, to attack Castro. None of that came together. What we do know is that in May 1963, Harvey traveled to Miami, and the trip to Miami was officially to close down ZR Rifle. That's what the documents say. That's what the official story would have to be. We know by some really good research done by people that it would appear that Roselli traveled secretly to Miami at the same time. So essentially the meeting was between Roselli and Harvey, and a third person was involved, may well have been Morales. A lot of mystery about the meeting, but by the summer of 1963, ZR Rifle is really being closed down. William Harvey is being relocated to Italy. He'll have his own problems and his own mission there. The Italian assignment doesn't go well for him. What, if anything, went ahead with John Roselli and David Morales and people that had been used in the ZR Rifle Castro assassination projects during the later half of 1963 is a totally different question. And people who have read my writing think that, might feel that I think that led to something in Dallas, and I still feel that way, but that really at that point in time had nothing to do with Staff D, it had nothing to do with QJWIN or ZR Rifle. It could have had anything at all, and may have had something at all to do with William Harvey, David Morales, and John Roselli. So that will kind of bring me to the end of this, and maybe we have some questions now.
Yes, David. David Hancock.
Hi, Larry. I wonder, I mean, forgive me for being naive and sceptical, but if official documents are saying they're closing this down, can we take from that necessarily that that was really the case? I mean, there's a lot of background chatter and what you might call chaff, certainly over the last 10, 20, 30 years, which suggests that Harvey, under the umbrella or auspices of ZR Rifle, particularly in Rome, kind of accessed various assassins, so on and so forth. What are your thoughts on that, Larry?
I think my thoughts is a lot of that truly is rumor and gossip. Okay. As far as ZR Rifle under Staff D is concerned, no, I think those documents are real because those documents talk about how the CIA operates. The CIA is really, it's a government agency like any other government agency. You know, yes, it has expense reports, it has to file accounting, it has to budget for things. Now that doesn't mean that there's not black money. I have a new book coming out later this year called Creating Chaos that goes into a lot of operations that that were funded with money that was shifted from one account to another. But as far as specifically these individuals, William Harvey, there's been a very good biography written on William Harvey. I do think you might trace things to William Harvey that he himself did and managed to come up with some limited funds for in Italy for a period of time. He wasn't in Italy at that point in time. He was chartered with working with criminal groups in Italy and supporting a number of things in Italy, influence operations that were going on that would have countered Communist Party influence. I'm not going to say that William Harvey did some things that were off the books in Italy. Beyond Italy, and no, I really don't see it. If I'm following your question correctly.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not naive enough to believe that everything that we know that goes on is found in CIA documents, but you've got to be very specific. I mean, interestingly enough, the CIA, for example, I give you an example. We know exactly how much the CIA spent in Italy, and in terms of millions and millions of dollars over 2 decades to essentially suborn free elections in Italy. But we know that. That's a matter of record. It shows up in the documents. So, when the U.S. government actually releases documents that are willing to admit that sort of thing, you're disclosing a lot of dirty laundry.
I have a question from Malcolm Blunt, Larry.
Yeah, I was
I'm ready.
wondering if Larry has any thoughts on the Lee Harvey Oswald file that surfaced in Staff D during the tenure of the House Select Committee in the mid-70s.
So, like, Malcolm is really going to ask me a question about documents. That he thinks I know and he doesn't know? Malcolm, come on now. Haven't we gotten over that yet?
Have you got any
I know
thoughts on
everything I learned. I know it's from you in the first place. No.
What's an Oswald file doing in Staff D?
Yes. That's what
I would say, my guess is that Staff D is, okay, so now we're going to pure speculation. I would say that Staff D is probably a holding area, as we've seen here. We've seen that Staff D includes crypts that are used with multiple people, and that Staff D is a place to embed extremely deniable people. I would not, and this is just raw speculation on my part, I would not, if somebody showed me documents proving that there was a Castro assassination project that somebody was working on involving around Lee Harvey Oswald and the name Lee Harvey Oswald and putting Lee Harvey Oswald into Cuba, I would not be shocked and amazed. I know of nothing that proves that yet, but that's the only thing that would make sense to me, seeing Lee Harvey Oswald and a file hidden within Staff D.
Shall I go back?
Yeah.
Yeah, Robert Blakey went to CIA with, he was obviously very surprised that an Oswald file surfaced in Staff D. And they sent a representative to meet with him called Edward Ryan. And Ed Ryan was as flummoxed as everybody else. He said that the only reason he could think that there would be an Oswald file in Staff D would be if for some reason Oswald had applied for crypto employment with the agency. Which is
Now that's
necessarily surprising.
okay, yeah, right. I'm thinking, but Malcolm, another interesting thought is, just as Helms was as Harvey was using Angleton as advice and getting advice on how to hide things, I wonder if there's any possibility that Angleton might have done something in regard to Lee Oswald to hide that within Staff D.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think, you know, it's somewhere where you could actually hide things, or you could run operations alongside or underneath, you know, using Staff D as a vehicle. Yeah,
I mean, we've talked about possibly using Lee Oswald as, you know, the name Lee Oswald, even not necessarily the person, or Harvey Lee Oswald, et cetera, as a poison pill in terms of counterintelligence activities in Mexico City and Cuba. And it just strikes me that these folks created a real problem for themselves, because letting Harvey and Angleton get together and essentially use something like Staff D, which is still within the Directorate of Operations, as a hiding place both for Crips and agents and money, means that either or both of them in concert could have used that. So even if, let's speculate wildly and say that sometime in the, the spring of 1963, they had been talking and both became aware of Lee Harvey Oswald, and both were looking at his, you know, during 1963, looking at his interest in Cuba and thinking about, you know, could either or both of them move Oswald into there as a potential? I don't know that would even mean that they used him. It just might mean that they were thinking about using the name. So, a fascinating question. I know we have discussed that. Unfortunately, I'm no smarter about that point now than the last time we discussed it.
Thanks, Larry. We've got Barry Keane with us, and he would like to ask a question.
Hi, Larry.
Hi, Barry.
Hi. Very interesting talk. I've learned a great deal today. My question to you is, does Staff D still exist in one form or another? Do you know?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't quite get
Does
that.
Staff D still exist in one form or another?
Oh, I'm absolutely sure Staff D, well, if Staff D still exists, I'm suspecting that Staff D exists in two forms. That it has become a regular, you know, the collections part is a regular part of CIA station operations overseas, and essentially I suspect that you find that function being performed within the stations. I think, my guess though is that NSA has grown so dramatically as compared to CIA, and I think that's one of the things that we don't really understand is the extent that as of 2018, CIA has been minimized in comparison to some of the other agencies, whether it be DIA or NSA or a couple of other agencies. It still exists, and actually I can do this, I can send it to Stuart. The best way to find it now is there's some actually excellent current contemporary studies of who does what within the American intelligence agencies. And I think you'll find that these field collections duties are now done by NSA personnel themselves, not relying on CIA and actually not trusting CIA. Basically, CIA, after 2001, has lost out in the turf wars in the American intelligence community to a large extent.
Okay, thanks, Larry.
Which is one reason I think you hear about CIA talk so much in the American news broadcast is that's not really where things are happening anymore to the extent that they were back in the 60s.
Okay, thanks.
Any more questions, folks? Yeah, Malcolm again.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I noticed that you didn't name the CIA stations chief in Luxembourg.
I did not. Can you? And we know who that was, but I honestly don't recall it off the top of my
Arnold
head.
Silver.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, and Bill Harvey was the case officer for the operation ST Escalade. That was the bug in the New China news agency. So Harvey himself was the case officer, and
So
Silver.
they should have had a fairly, like,
Yeah, and-
close relationship for Harvey's work.
Yeah, and Silver went to Harvey to ask him about that operation. He'd heard about the operation, and Harvey told Silver that Silver asked Harvey how many times the operatives had been through Havana Airport, and then when Harvey told him 5 times they'd been to Cuba, Silver told him to pull the operation, and Harvey refused to pull that operation. And then,
That would have
then
been
of course,
good advice.
they were arrested. Yeah, that's right.
Actually, I think one of the best CIA, and the CIA's done some really good studies on itself, and the studies that they did and published on that operation in Cuba was really it was a very professional study on why we shouldn't do things this way and how much trouble it gets us into. And it's one of the best internal studies I've seen. But I think that brings up a really good point, Malcolm, and that is that, again, sometimes we, yes, Harvey had worked in Berlin, Harvey had a lot of personal contacts, had managed a lot of people, but again, the fact that he wasn't, he had to rely on other people a lot. He didn't have personal contacts all across Europe. He didn't, he had to go to other people and bring them in. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think when I started working on this, you just kind of like, well, Harvey went to Europe and started doing things. Well, Harvey spent a lot of time talking to people and getting input and recommendations and feedback before he even made his first field trip to Europe for Staff D recruiting.
Hmm.
Any more questions?
Yes, one more question from David Percox again, no?
Very briefly, Larry, I'm being really flippant as well as naive, so forgive me. I'm referring to your earlier response where you mentioned about the funding and money all being accounted for, and we can all see what ZR Rifle and Staff D were up to. What about other operations where off-book operations where the money's being provided from elsewhere? How much credibility can we attribute to that idea?
That's where things really begin. Absolutely, there's credibility, but the credibility, what I've found in terms of that other kind of funding is it's money that, here's how what I've seen generally work, is CIA officers become involved with assets in projects. And both the officers and the assets become very dedicated to these projects. And they become very annoyed by interference from headquarters. They become very annoyed by budget cuts. So what happens is they start literally doing their own, I wouldn't even call them vest pocket operations, because in many cases they're not sanctioned. There may be a wink or a head nod, like, okay, you guys do what you need to do, but at that point in time, that's where they become ensnared with money from things like drug smuggling and weapons deals, and all they're really doing is letting the people that work for them, that are involved, these are usually locals, or, they're not CIA employees, they're revolutionaries, insurgents, expatriates. They allow them to begin funding themselves. And in some cases, it's moderately small amounts of money, but it can grow to immense amounts of money. I mean, and I don't want to tout it, that's what I look at a lot in this new book I've written in terms of how does this sort of thing become privatized? And that's the word that I've begun using for it is because these sorts of operations, especially if they involve regime change or assassinations, do become privatized with other people's money, and they go out of control. I'm not even sure it's right to call them rogue. They take on their own lives, and you have to get back to the individuals who are associating with them to even find out if they realize what's going on. And so many of America's major mistakes have come from letting that happen, starting with a small project, getting local officers and assets really excited and committing to it, and then backing off from it. And it still goes on. And it's really depressing. But I'm trying to give a very broad answer to your question rather than confining myself just to like 1963, because I think everybody here or who's listening probably knows that I've written about what I think happened with John Kennedy, which is a set of rogue CIA officers going ahead with their own assets and doing something at their own initiative.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you very much, Larry. One more.
But do remember that word privatization, very interesting concept, how intelligence operations can become privately funded and take on a life of their own.
One more. Please.
Larry, yeah, just talking to rogue ops, what's your feeling of Marita Lorenzi's testimony in the Hunt versus Liberty lobby case, where she's testified with Farini, Sturgis, and the journey from Miami to Dallas, and the meeting with Howard Hunt?
I honestly, and I know this takes me out of the mainstream, but I, at this point in time, believe very little that came out of Sturgis or Hunt or Fiorini, other than the fact, and this is what I've come to conclude, all of these people were socially networked enough to the people that were involved with Dallas so that they understood the general concept of what happened. Okay, certain CI officers got certain Cuban exiles and their friends involved, and it happened. All of these people knew that happened, and so they started adding to it to enhance their own credibility, to sometimes even help them raise funds for things they wanted to continue to do. As far as Hunt's story about what happened, literally, the only thing I believe out of that story has to do with the fact that he knew that David and Morales were involved. So it's like I think they knew the general picture and they talked to enhance their own reputation and image. I don't think that helps us understand at all the details of what happened. And I know, and I don't know if Malcolm was in the meeting in Dallas, we had a long presentation a few years ago from people that were directly involved with Howard Hunt and knew how his story came about and how it really was essentially created to get money for Howard Hunt and taken over by his son, and he never really could come up with anything to document it, and all he ever provided was a little flowchart with 6 names on it, and he couldn't give a single detail to validate it. Where did he meet Morales in Miami? Where did he have his meeting? When did he travel to Miami to have that meeting where he was being recruited? Nothing, not a single piece of data that could corroborate it. So I guess my general answer to your question is the caravan to Dallas, I think people did travel to Dallas from Miami. I don't think it was in a caravan. I don't think Marita Lorenz was in a caravan. that would have been insane. This is a woman that's showing up being stalked around Miami by reporters getting pictures because she was in a lawsuit against a Latin American dictator she just had a baby with. You don't take that person and put them in a caravan to go to Dallas to kill a president.
Larry, thank you very much for your...
Sorry.
Thanks very much for your time. Much appreciated. You do it every year for us, and we really are appreciative. Thanks very much indeed.
Certainly, I appreciate it. The best to all of you. If you have any questions for me on anything that come up during the conference, just give them to Stuart. Stuart, if you'll send them by email, I'll reply by email, and I will send the references. If you really want to know who's doing what in American intelligence today, there's some very good source material, and I'll send that along.
Thank you very much, Larry. Thank you.
Have a great conference.
Thanks very much, Roy. Cheers, Larry. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Right. I think we'll have the full 20 minutes, so we'll come back here at 5:10. Yeah. We'll see with the professor. Sorry, 4:10, yes.
Assassination. What I did and